On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked across the grounds of the Tower of London toward a wooden scaffold built specifically for her execution. She was 35 years old. 3 years earlier she had been crowned Queen of England in a ceremony so lavish it bankrupted half the treasury. Now she wore grey, the colour reserved for condemned women, and every step brought her closer to a French executioner. Henry VIII had imported because he believed a sword would be more merciful than an English axe. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. Anne wasn't the exception. She was the rule. For every queen who died young, there was 7 more who survived something arguably worse. A lifetime of calculated cruelty designed to break them without killing them. Because death, as horrific as it sounds, offered escape. What these 7 women endured required them to wake up every single morning and make impossible choices, to betray their own daughters, to watch their friends tortured, to smile at the men who beat them, and to pretend that the golden prison wrapped around their throats was actually a crown. Picture yourself born in 1519 into the House of Medici. Your name is Catherine, and before you're even old enough to read, you've already been promised to the second son of the King of France. You're 14 when you marry Henry of Valois on October 28, 1533. You arrive in a foreign country where no one speaks your language, where the courtiers mock your accent and call you the merchantess daughter because your family made their fortune in banking rather than inheriting it through bloodlines. And here's where the nightmare begins. Your husband doesn't love you. He doesn't even like you. He's obsessed with Diane de Poitiers, a woman 19 years older than him, and he makes sure you know it. Diane sits at the high table during state dinners. Diane receives the jewelry meant for you. Diane sleeps in the bedchamber next to your husband's while you're kept 3 doors down. And every single lady in your service reports directly to her. They tell her what you eat, when you cry, what you say in your sleep, whether your monthly courses have come. Your body isn't yours. Your privacy isn't yours. Even your grief belongs to someone else. For 10 years, Catherine de Medici fails to produce a child. 10 years of physicians examining her in front of audiences, of priests praying over her womb, of whispers that she must be cursed or barren or secretly sinning against God. The French court begins discussing annulment. They're going to send her back to Italy like defective merchandise. And everyone knows what happens to royal wives who get returned. They vanish into convents where they're forgotten, or worse, they're quietly poisoned to prevent them from remarrying and creating political complications. But then, almost miraculously, Catherine becomes pregnant. She delivers a son on January 19, 1544, then another, then another. By the time she's done, she's survived 11 pregnancies, each one nearly killing her. Each one performed under the watchful eyes of Diane de Poitiers, who examines every child to make sure they're legitimate. And through it all, Catherine learns the most important lesson any queen could learn. Survival doesn't come from love or loyalty or divine right. It comes from becoming more dangerous than the people trying to destroy you. The system itself was designed as a trap. From the moment a girl was born into royalty, she became a negotiable asset in her father's political portfolio. Margaret of Anjou was 6 years old in 1435 when her father, René of Anjou, signed the contract promising her to Henry VI of England. 6. She spent the next 9 years being prepared for a role that would eventually destroy her learning to speak English, to emulate English customs, to understand that her only value existed between her legs and in her ability to produce male heirs. When she finally arrived in England at 15, she discovered her husband suffered from severe mental illness, collapsing into catatonic states that could last for months. The kingdom was fracturing into civil war, and Margaret, barely more than a child herself, was expected to govern in his place while pretending everything was perfectly normal. She was blamed for every military defeat, every political disaster, every moment of chaos, because women in power were always the easiest scapegoats. And when the Wars of the Roses finally consumed everything, Margaret watched her only son killed in battle, her husband murdered in the Tower of London, and her entire world reduced to ashes. She survived, but at what cost? If you've made it this far into this story, you already understand something most people never realize about history. These weren't characters in a fairy tale. They were real women who felt fear the same way you do, who loved their children the same way your mother loves you, who lay awake at night wondering if tomorrow would be the day someone decided they were no longer useful. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as entertainment, but as testimony. So if you believe these voices matter, if you think we should keep telling the truth about what women endured, hit that subscribe button. Because the deeper we go into this story, the darker it gets, and you need to be prepared for what comes next. Mary Stuart was born on December 8, 1542, and became Queen of Scotland 6 days later when her father died. 6 days old, and already she wore a crown that would eventually lead her to a scaffold. But before we get to her execution, we need to talk about the 18 years she spent as a prisoner of her own cousin, Elizabeth I of England. 18 years. That's longer than some people's entire lives. Mary was kept in a series of cold, damp castles, moved every few months so she could establish relationships with guards or servants who might help her escape. She was denied access to her son, forbidden from receiving visitors without supervision, and subjected to endless interrogations designed to trap her into confessing treason. Her health deteriorated until she could barely walk. She developed rheumatism so severe that some mornings she couldn't hold a pen, and through it all she knew exactly how the story would end. Because Elizabeth had already executed hundreds of Catholics and political rivals, Mary's only question was when, not if. What makes Mary's story particularly haunting is that she wasn't executed for anything she actually did. She was executed for existing. As long as she lived, she represented an alternative claim to the English throne, and that made her dangerous to Elizabeth whether she conspired or not. When Elizabeth finally signed the death warrant on February 1, 1587, she did so with a hand that trembled not from mercy, but from the knowledge that she was killing her own blood. Mary walked to her execution on February 8, 1587, wearing a dark red dress, the Catholic color of martyrdom. She had to climb onto the scaffold with assistance because her body had been so broken by imprisonment. And then came the horror that no one wants to talk about. The executioner was inexperienced and terrified. His first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head. The second blow cut deeper but still didn't sever completely. It took a third strike to finish the job, and even then, when he held up her head to show the crowd, her lips were still moving in silent prayer. Some witnesses said they continued moving for nearly 15 minutes after her body stopped twitching. Whether that's medically accurate or trauma-induced hallucination tells you everything about how deeply this execution scarred everyone who witnessed it. But Mary's execution was public theater designed to send a message. Other queens suffered in private, and their stories are even more disturbing because no one documented them with the same detail. Joanna of Castile, born in 1479, was one of the most educated and politically astute women of her generation. She spoke 6 languages, understood statecraft better than most of her male advisors, and should have ruled Castile as its rightful queen. Instead, when her husband Philip the Handsome died suddenly in 1506, her father Ferdinand and later her son Charles declared her insane and locked her away. For 46 years Joanna lived in a single tower in Tordesillas, Spain. 46 years she outlived her father, her son, and most of her grandchildren, spending nearly half a century in isolation, because it was politically convenient for the men in her life to pretend she was mad. Records from people who visited her reveal she was perfectly rational, articulate, and aware of exactly what was being done to her. Her supposed madness was a legal fiction that allowed her male relatives to rule in her name while keeping her imprisoned. When she finally died on April 12, 1555, at the age of 75, she had spent more than half her life locked away, not because she was dangerous, but because she was inconvenient. And then there's Catherine de' Medici's final transformation. After surviving decades of humiliation, after watching Diane de Poitiers control her husband until his death in 1559, Catherine finally found herself in a position of real power as Queen Mother. And this is where the story gets truly dark. Because Catherine had learned that mercy was a luxury queens couldn't afford. She became one of the most ruthless political operators in European history, orchestrating assassinations, manipulating civil wars, and allegedly maintaining a network of female spies and poisoners known as her Flying Squadron. Whether the poisoned perfume glove story is true or exaggerated legend, Catherine absolutely used murder as a political tool. She did it to protect her sons. She did it to maintain her position. But most of all, she did it because she knew from brutal experience that the moment she showed weakness she would be destroyed. In a letter to her daughter Elizabeth of Valois in 1564, Catherine wrote something that should break your heart. She said, "I have done things that will condemn my soul, but I did them so you would never have to." Think about that. A mother so thoroughly brutalized by the system that she became a monster specifically to spare her daughter the same fate. Elizabeth I of England made a different choice entirely. Born on September 7, 1533, she watched her mother Anne Boleyn executed when she was just 2 years old. She watched her father marry and discard or murder for more wives. She watched her half-sister Mary I execute hundreds of Protestants and die alone, unloved, and unmourned. And Elizabeth learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Marriage meant death. So she refused. For 44 years she ruled England without a husband, enduring constant pressure from her advisors to marry, facing countless assassination attempts and living with the knowledge that she would die alone because she refused to give any man power over her life. She ordered the execution of Mary Stuart not because she hated her, but because she understood that men would use Mary as a weapon against her forever if she lived. After signing the death warrant, Elizabeth wrote in her private diary, "I have murdered my own blood, and with it, I have murdered whatever remained of my own heart." She died on March 24, 1603. Surrounded by advisors and courtiers but utterly, devastatingly alone. She had survived. But survival had cost her everything that makes life worth living. These 7 queens, Catherine de' Medici, Margaret of Anjou, Mary Stuart, Joanna of Castile, Elizabeth I, and the countless others whose names we've lost, didn't just survive atrocities worse than death. They survived by becoming people they never wanted to be. They betrayed friends to prove loyalty. They abandoned principles to maintain power. They sacrificed love to ensure survival. And they did all of it knowing that history would remember them as villains, or madwomen, or cold-hearted tyrants, because that's what women have to become when the only alternative is annihilation. The next time you see a portrait of a queen in a museum, look at her eyes. Really look, because behind the jewels and the composure and the regal bearing, you're looking at someone who went to sleep every night wondering if she would wake up, someone who smiled at the people plotting her death, someone who buried her children, her dignity and her dreams just to see one more sunrise. They survived, but the price they paid should haunt us all. So here's my question for you. After hearing what these women endured, after understanding the impossible choices they faced, do you think you would have survived? And more importantly, what would you have been willing to become in order to do it? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because these stories aren't just history. They're warnings about what happens when power, control, and survival collide. And they're reminders that sometimes the people who lived are the ones who suffered most.